Sometimes the most powerful words are born from the most deafening silence. And for entire weeks, this silence weighed like a storm forming on the horizon of American basketball, charged with electrical tension that anyone could feel on their skin. You can tell that something was deeply wrong when one of the sport's greatest rising stars was being systematically attacked. And no one with the power to change it said a single word. It was like watching a fire spread while firefighters stood, still, watching. Caitlin Clark wasn't just another promising player. She had become a phenomenon that transcended women's basketball in ways that seemed impossible just a few months before. Drawing crowds that rivaled NBA games, breaking audience records that WNBA executives only dreamed of in their most optimistic moments, forcing entire arenas to sell out with an energy that women's basketball had never experienced. But with this meteoric fame came something sinister. Something that made the Edayard's blood of millions of fans boil with pure indignation. It was like watching pure talent being punished simply for existing. The fouls weren't just hard. They were calculated, intentional, disproportionate to what any game situation would justify. As if each opponent had decided that the only way to deal with the Caitlin Clark phenomenon was through systematic physical intimidation. Elbows flying with surgical precision, unnecessary pushes that sent clear messages, falls that made hearts stop and left spectators holding their breath. And what was most impressive was the pattern. These weren't isolated incidents. It was a coordinated campaign of aggression that any person with functioning eyes could identify. Game after game, opponent after opponent, the same script unfolded. Attack first, play basketball later. To understand the magnitude of what happened next, you need to feel the weight of that institutional silence that became more deafening with each passing day. The WNBA, the league, that should protect its biggest star, its golden goose, its financial salvation, remained silent as a tomb. Officials avoided the subject as if it were radioactive, deflecting questions with the agility of experienced politicians. Official commentators danced around the issue with the delicacy of someone stepping on eggs, talking about physical play and competitiveness, when everyone knew they were witnessing something much darker. It was the kind of silence that speaks louder than any scream. The kind of silence that reveals institutional priorities with crystal clarity. But have you ever wondered what happens when silence becomes louder than any scream? When the absence of words begins to echo louder than the most powerful words ever spoken? You could feel the tension accumulating like electrical energy before a storm. Fans exploded on social media with fury that grew exponentially with each unpunished foul, each ignored push, each moment of unnecessary violence that passed without consequences. Analysts whispered behind the scenes, sharing frustrations they couldn't express publicly. The pressure grew, until something had to explode. It was like watching a pressure cooker approaching its breaking point. Everyone could feel that something monumental was about to happen. And then, at a moment that no one expected, but everyone desperately needed, the silence was shattered with the force of a meteor hitting Earth. Not by the WNBA, which had chosen cowardice instead of leadership. Not by the officials, who had prioritized politics instead of protection. Not by the official commentators who were afraid of their own shadows and preferred safety to truth. The silence was broken by someone who owed nothing to anyone, who had enough credibility to move mountains with his words, and who had reached his absolute limit watching an injustice unfold before his eyes like a slow-motion accident. Steph Curry had spent years observing the development of Women's basketball with the silent respect of someone who truly understands the game in its deepest aspects. He knew talent when he saw it, recognized greatness in formation, and understood the technical nuances that separated good players from special players. And he had watched Caitlin Clark be turned into a punching bag, while the league that should celebrate her remained pathologically mute. Curry wasn't just another sports commentator offering superficial opinions. He was the man who had literally redefined what was possible in basketball. The revolutionary who forced the entire NBA to rethink defensive strategies. The shooter who had transformed impossible shots into daily routine. How is it possible that the greatest shooter in basketball history remains silent when he sees another extraordinary shooter being systematically persecuted? The answer is simple. It's not possible. Not for someone with Steph Curry's moral integrity. Curry isn't just a player, he's a living institution, a standard of excellence, a moral reference in the world of sports. When he speaks about basketball, entire continents stop to listen. His words carry the weight of 3 NBA titles, 2 MVPs, and a revolution in the game that changed the sport forever. When Steph Curry decides it's time to take a stand, you can be absolutely certain that something seismic is about to happen. And at that specific moment, watching another sequence of targeted aggressions against Caitlin Clark, something inside Curry simply broke, like a rope stretched beyond its resistance limit. It wasn't a calculated public relations decision crafted by a marketing team. It wasn't a corporate strategy to score points with a certain audience. It was the visceral, authentic, irrepressible reaction of a true student of the game who had witnessed an injustice for too long and reached his emotional breaking point. The atmosphere before his statements was dense, like morning fog that obscures vision. Journalists approached him expecting the usual diplomatically crafted responses, the safe statements that offend no one and say nothing substantial. Cameras positioned themselves, anticipating another polite and politically correct comment. No one was remotely prepared for what was about to happen. It was like being in the presence of a volcano moments before eruption. All the signs were there, but no one anticipated the magnitude of the explosion that was approaching. Because when a man like Steph Curry decides he's had enough, when he chooses to transform his accumulated frustration into words that will echo throughout the world of sports, when he decides to use his supreme credibility as a weapon of protection, you know you're witnessing one of those moments that divide history into before and after. The silence that had dominated for weeks was about to be replaced by something much more powerful. The truth told by someone who wasn't afraid to say it, no matter the consequences. And what he said next didn't just defend Caitlin Clark. His words literally redefined what support means in the world of professional sports. How many times in life do we witness the exact moment when someone decides that enough is enough? How many times do we see a person with real power use that power for something infinitely greater than themselves? You're about to discover that when Steph Curry decides to break the silence, he doesn't just speak. He explodes with the force of supernovas. And when he explodes, the entire world doesn't just tremble, it transforms. Naturally, this leads us to a moment that will be remembered as a watershed in the history of American basketball. A moment when the greatest living legend of the three-point shot looked at Caitlin Clark and saw something that few had the courage to recognize publicly, even when it was obvious to any honest observer. Something that was about to change everything forever. The storm that had been forming for weeks was finally ready to unleash upon the world of sports. And Steph Curry would be the deafening thunder that would announce a new era. It's impossible not to feel the electricity in the air when a historic moment is about to happen. and all cosmic signs indicated that something extraordinary was about to explode on the surface of sporting reality. The silence had ended. The truth was about to be told with a force that no one anticipated, and the world of basketball would never be the same. And then it happened. The moment the basketball world was waiting for, without knowing, it was waiting, like a symphony awaiting its final crescendo. Steph Curry didn't just break the silence, he pulverized it with the force of a meteor hitting Earth, sending shock waves that would reach entire continents. You can tell that something extraordinary is about to happen when the greatest three-point shot revolutionary in history decides to compare his own game to that of another person. But this wasn't just any comparison made out of politeness or diplomacy. It was a declaration that would echo across continents, leave critics literally speechless, and redefine what recognition means in professional sports. The first words that came out of his mouth cut through the air like a sharp blade. "I'm tired of watching Caitlin Clark being attacked." There were no elaborate detours. There was no carefully calculated diplomacy. There was no type of corporate language that everyone expected. It was direct, visceral, authentic as a primal scream. If the league doesn't step in to protect her, things are going to get ugly very quickly. You could feel the shock running through the room like an electrical wave. The air became dense, charged with tension that anyone could touch. Journalists looked at each other with absolute incredulity, as if they couldn't process what they had just heard. Cameras automatically adjusted, operators instinctively knowing they were capturing something historic. You could hear hearts accelerating, breaths being held, but Steph Curry was just warming up the engines. He had broken the silence barrier, and now nothing would stop him from telling the whole truth. How is it possible that someone who revolutionized world basketball with his shooting maintains composure when talking about another revolutionary being systematically persecuted? The answer came in the form of the most devastating and precise technical analysis ever made about a women's basketball player by an NBA legend. It was like watching a master recognizing another master. "I saw someone analyze her shot release time," Curry continued, his voice carrying the technical authority of someone who had spent decades perfecting the science and art of the perfect shot. Each word was measured, precise, loaded with technical meaning that few in the world were qualified to give. "Which is practically identical to mine." Let that sink in for a long and deep moment. Steph Curry, the E-type man who broke every conceivable three-point shot record, the player who forced coaches worldwide to rethink fundamental defensive strategies, the revolutionary who changed the game forever, had just said that Caitlin Clark had a release time identical to his. Not similar, not close, not almost as good as. Identical. It was like Einstein validating another physicist's theory of relativity. Like Michelangelo recognizing another artist's painting technique. Like Mozart approving another musician's composition. It was validation at the highest possible level. The atmosphere in the room completely transformed, as if the very air had changed chemical composition. It was like watching a master craftsman recognize another master craftsman with the clinical precision of someone who truly understands their craft. But Curry was far from finished, demolishing all expectations and prejudices. "And then her confidence," he continued, and you could feel genuine admiration growing in his voice like a wave forming in the ocean. "Obviously, you can't help but pay attention when she plays. From where she's shooting, the range, the confidence, the natural talent, she's a performer." How many times in life do we witness the exact moment when an absolute icon recognizes another icon in formation before our eyes? Curry was doing something that completely transcended traditional basketball. He was using his supreme credibility, his position as the greatest shooter in human history, to shield Caitlin Clark against all the negativity, resistance, and hostility that had accumulated around her like a toxic storm. But then he said something that made critics across the country literally speechless, as if their vocal cords had been cut. It's impressive, because simply by the fact that her shooting is at that level. Curry paused, letting tension accumulate like electrical energy. If you really pay attention, her court game is equally impressive. It's like the complete package. The complete package. Steph Curry, two-time NBA MVP, three-time world champion, the man who changed basketball forever and redefined what was considered impossible, had just called Caitlin Clark the complete package. It was impossible not to feel the seismic impact of these words reverberating through the sports world like earthquake waves. Critics who had spent entire months minimizing Caitlin's talent, building narratives to diminish her achievements, suddenly found themselves face to face with an incontestable reality. If Steph Curry says someone has the complete package, that person has the complete package. Period. Social media exploded instantly. It wasn't a gradual buzz that develops over hours. It was a volcanic eruption of reactions that ranged from absolute incredulity to deep emotional validation, passing through every possible spectrum of human emotion. What's most impressive is how Curry didn't limit himself just to the cold and calculated technical aspect. He delved into what really differentiates great players from true legends: magnetic presence, unshakable confidence even under extreme pressure, the ability to perform when all the world's eyes are watching. "She's a performer," he had said, with the conviction of someone who recognizes a rare quality when they see it. And coming from Steph Curry, these words carried the weight of decades of performances that made millions of people around the world hold their breath and believe in magic. Have you ever wondered what happens when someone with supreme technical credibility decides to use that credibility as a shield to protect another person? The result is transformational at a level that transcends sports. Critics who had built entire careers attacking players, developing sophisticated arguments to minimize achievements, suddenly found themselves completely disarmed. How do you argue against Steph Curry about shooting? How do you question the technical analysis of the man who literally redefined what's possible in basketball? How do you debate with the absolute master of the craft? The answer is simple and devastating. You can't. There's no possible argument. It was like trying to debate physics with Einstein, art with Da Vinci, or music with Beethoven. Certain people transcend discussion and enter the realm of absolute authority. Naturally, this leads us to the immediate impact of these statements that spread throughout the world like fire in dry forest. Because when Steph Curry speaks, the world doesn't just listen. The world reacts with an intensity that few can generate. Phones began ringing incessantly in newspaper newsrooms around the entire country. TV producers canceled carefully planned segments to give urgent space for analyses of Curry's statements. Social media transformed into digital battlefields between those who had always supported Caitlin Clark and those who reluctantly began to reconsider their entrenched positions. Sports commentators who had avoided the subject as if it were radioactive suddenly found themselves forced to address the issue head-on. Media executives gathered in conference rooms to discuss how to cover the phenomenon. Even people who had never watched basketball in their lives began to pay attention. But what really mattered weren't the immediate and superficial reactions. What mattered was that Steph Curry had just used his voice. The most respected and influential voice in world basketball, to draw a definitive line in the sand. On one side of this line were those who recognized greatness when they saw it, who accepted evidence when presented, who had the humility to recognize extraordinary talent. On the other side were those who would continue to resist, even in the face of the most irrefutable evidence possible, even when confronted with supreme validation. And this line that Curry drew with his explosive words? It was about to divide the entire world of professional basketball in ways that no one anticipated. It was like watching continents separating geologically. Once the fissure began, there was no way to stop it. What happened next was something that no one could have predicted in the epic magnitude it took. Steph Curry's words didn't just echo through the sports world. They created a chain reaction that exposed the true colors of every professional basketball star with the precision of an emotional X-ray. You can tell that something fundamental changed in cultural dynamics when players who normally maintain themselves carefully neutral on controversial issues begin to take definitive and irreversible public positions. And what followed Curry's explosive statements was a division that cut through the heart of American basketball like a sharp blade, separating not just opinions, but entire philosophies about recognition and justice. On one side, giants of the sport rose up to defend not just Caitlin Clark specifically, but the very fundamental principles of justice, protection, and recognition in professional sports. On the other side, deafening silences and deliberately calculated choices revealed deep resistances that many preferred to keep carefully hidden. LeBron James was one of the first to break his own characteristic silence on controversial issues. And when the king decides to speak, entire dynasties move like tectonic plates. "Everybody's looking for you to say anything," LeBron said, his voice carrying the emotional weight of 2 decades dealing with media pressure that few human beings can even imagine. And they're going to cut and edit and turn it into something negative. But one thing I love about what she's bringing to the sport: more people want to watch, more people want to tune in. It was impossible not to feel the deep and visceral empathy in his words. LeBron intimately knew the psychological burden of carrying impossible expectations on his shoulders, of being the constant target of criticism regardless of his achievements, of having every movement dissected and distorted by agendas that were beyond his control. And he was recognizing that Caitlin Clark was facing something even more intense and concentrated. But then he said something that made the entire world stop to listen with total attention. "I saw for the first time that they got a charter plane for the first time in the history of the league. They flew private jet. That should be celebrated alone." Charter planes. LeBron James, the man who had transformed the concept of player executive and redefined negotiating power in professional sports, was highlighting how Caitlin Clark had forced the WNBA to evolve structurally in a matter of months. She wasn't just breaking statistical records. She was breaking systematic and institutional barriers that had existed for decades as insurmountable walls. How is it possible that a rookie player forces structural changes that veterans fought to achieve for years without success? The answer was becoming increasingly clear, with implications that transcended sports. Because some people are born to completely redefine what's possible, regardless of established systems. Luka Doncic, known worldwide for his brutal honesty and complete lack of diplomatic filter, was asked about his favorite women's player during an interview. His response was as direct as it was devastating for any contrary narrative. "Caitlin Clark," he said without hesitation, as if the question were so obvious it didn't merit elaboration. When specifically pressed about other talented players, including well-known college phenomena, Luka was even more specific and definitive. "She's okay. Haven't seen her playing in the WNBA. It was a crystalline pattern that was establishing itself. Royalty, recognizing royalty with merciless standards. Luka, a European phenomenon who had conquered instant respect in the NBA through pure performance, was applying the same brutal criterion that he applied to himself. Wasn't enough to have theoretical talent or college potential. You had to prove consistently at the highest possible level. Trae Young, another young long-range shooting wizard who had redefined offensive possibilities, went even further by publicly suggesting a direct three-point competition with Caitlin. "I would definitely have to practice way more than I practiced for these previous competitions," he admitted with a smile that showed genuine respect and perhaps even a hint of competitive concern. It was the type of recognition that transcends politeness or diplomacy. It was an elite competitor admitting they would need to prepare specifically to face another elite competitor. Pascal Siakam offered perhaps the most revealing and surprising perspective of all. When asked about which player received more love and admiration from fans, he compared Caitlin Clark directly with Tyrese Halliburton, his own NBA teammate and an established all-star, and chose Caitlin without hesitation. "Caitlin Clark, she's a beast, man. And they love her," Pascal said with absolute conviction. Probably would say Caitlin Clark. "I love Tyrese, but she's on another level in terms of the love she receives." Another level. An NBA star, world champion, was literally placing a WNBA player on another level compared to an NBA all-star. It was recognition that transcended traditional categories. What's most impressive is how each statement of support carried a different and specific layer of validation. LeBron spoke from the perspective of transformational cultural impact. Curry had spoken about pure technical excellence. Luka spoke about merciless professional standards. Pascal spoke about magnetic connection with fans. Trae spoke about competition between equals. All possible angles converged to the same inescapable conclusion. Caitlin Clark had transcended all traditional categories and created a new category of her own. But have you ever wondered what happens when not everyone is willing to recognize the greatness that's happening right before their eyes? The resistance came in subtle, but equally revealing and significant ways. Jason Tatum was directly asked about his favorite WNBA player during a routine interview. The question was simple, open, a perfect opportunity to recognize what literally the entire world was discussing. His response? Aja Wilson. Without elaboration, without context, without even mentioning the name that dominated every conversation about women's basketball. It was the type of silence that speaks louder than any speech. In a historic moment where recognition cost absolutely zero and meant everything to millions of people, Tatum chose to deliberately ignore the gigantic elephant in the room. Kevin Durant was even more deliberate and calculated in his choice. When asked specifically about his favorite female athlete, he responded without hesitation. Angel Reese. It wasn't just an innocent personal preference, it was a statement of political and cultural positioning. At a moment when Caitlin Clark was being systematically attacked, Durant chose to publicly support her biggest media and symbolic rival. Paul George offered a more nuanced but equally revealing perspective. He recognized Caitlin's talent, but contextualized her ascension in a way that many interpreted as subtly diminishing. "You gotta put it in perspective," George said. "These girls have been working hard to grow the game of women's basketball in the WNBA. They've been working hard to grow the sport globally, the audiences. And then you have this girl who comes from college, and it's an instant change. She basically got handed being the face of the league. There's gonna be girls that are gonna be offended by that." It was recognition mixed with justification for resistance. Paul George wasn't denying Caitlin's greatness, but he was humanizing and legitimizing the hostility she faced. Naturally, this leads us to a profound realization about the fundamental nature of true greatness. It doesn't inspire comfortable neutrality. It forces difficult choices. It compels people to reveal who they really are when confronted with paradigmatic changes. And the choices that followed Curry's explosive statements created a crystalline dividing line in professional basketball that extended far beyond sports. On one side, you had Steph Curry comparing shooting techniques with scientific precision, LeBron James celebrating historic impact and structural changes, Luka Doncic applying elite standards without compromise, Pascal Siakam recognizing categorical transcendence, Trae Young proposing competitions between equals as a sign of supreme respect. On the other side, you had carefully calculated silences and deliberate choices that spoke volumes without pronouncing specific words. It's impossible not to notice that this division reflected something much larger and deeper than personal preferences or individual loyalties. It revealed fundamental philosophies about recognition, change, and who was willing to accept new realities when they emerged right before their eyes, and who chose to resist these realities for reasons that only they completely understood. The line that Steph Curry had drawn with his explosive words wasn't just dividing superficial opinions. It was dividing historic eras. It was separating those who embraced the inevitable future from those who desperately clung to the familiar past. And the future? The future was about to arrive with a transformational force that no one had anticipated. Because when giants publicly divide over fundamental issues, the shockwaves reverberate far beyond the world of sports. They hit popular culture, mainstream media, family conversations around the entire country, and even international discussions about justice and recognition. And what was about to happen would forever transform not just how we see women's basketball, but how we understand the devastating power of the right words said at the right time by people with the right credibility to change the world. The division was complete and irreversible. The lines were drawn with permanent ink, and millions of people around the world were about to discover which side of history they wanted to be on when the future looked back and judged this moment. And then something happened that no one could have predicted in the epic and global magnitude it took. Steph Curry's words didn't just create local or regional waves. They unleashed an emotional tsunami that swept entire continents like a force of nature impossible to contain. You can tell that something completely transcended sports when mothers in small interior towns begin showing videos of Curry's statements to their teenage daughters. When fathers use his words as a moral example of how to defend what's right, regardless of social pressure. When people who never watched basketball in their lives suddenly find themselves sharing emotional clips on social media with tears in their eyes. The impact was instantaneous, global, and completely transformational. It wasn't just viral in the superficial sense of the word, it was revolutionary in the deepest possible sense. Within hours, Steph defends Caitlyn became the #1 trending topic worldwide. Not just in the United States, where the story had begun. Throughout the entire world. Brazil, United Kingdom, France, Germany, Australia, Japan, South Korea. People from completely different cultures, speaking distinct languages, living diverse economic realities, all connecting through a universal message that transcended borders. The moral courage to defend greatness when it's being systematically attacked. It was impossible not to feel the pure emotional electricity that ran through every post, every comment, every share, every reaction. People weren't simply reacting to a passing sports news story. They were actively participating in a moment of cultural definition that would be remembered for decades. Social media literally transformed into an infinite ocean of gratitude, validation, and collective emotional catharsis. Caitlin Clark fans who had felt isolated and attacked in defending her suddenly discovered they weren't alone in a lost battle, that millions of people around the world had been silently observing the same injustices and feeling the same growing indignation. It was like lighting a candle in a dark room and discovering there were millions of other people holding candles, waiting for someone to make the first move. But what's most impressive weren't the astronomical engagement numbers. They were the deeply touching human stories that emerged. A mother from Ohio posted a viral video of her 12-year-old daughter watching Curry's statements for the first time and beginning to cry with pure emotional relief. Finally, someone with real power said, "What I've been feeling for months," the girl had said between sobs. "I wasn't crazy. I wasn't seeing things. Injustice really was happening." A high school coach in Texas shared how he used Curry's exact words to teach his teenage players about moral leadership in difficult moments. "Look at how a true champion defends other champions," he told the assembled team. "Look at how greatness recognizes greatness. Look at how courage inspires more courage." A 75-year-old grandmother in Nevada, who confessed she had never watched women's basketball in her entire life, began religiously following Caitlin Clark's games specifically because of what Curry had said. "If it's important enough for Steph Curry to defend publicly, it's important enough for me to pay attention," she wrote in a letter to a local newspaper. A university professor in California integrated Curry's statements into a class about ethical leadership. Students who normally showed disinterest in sports spent 2 hours passionately debating moral courage and responsible use of influence. How is it possible that words about basketball touch so deeply on universal questions of justice, moral courage, and basic human recognition? The answer was becoming crystalline for millions of people, because Steph Curry hadn't just defended a specific player in a particular situation. He had defended the very philosophical idea that true greatness deserves active protection, not systematic persecution. Naturally, this leads us to the deepest and most lasting impact of all. Curry's statements didn't just change superficial conversations or temporary opinions, they changed concrete behaviors and fundamental attitudes in measurable ways. Audiences for Caitlin Clark's games exploded to levels that literally rivaled NBA playoffs. These weren't just traditional basketball fans tuning in out of curiosity. These were people completely new to the sport, who wanted to witness firsthand the exceptional talent that had inspired the greatest shooter in history to break his characteristic silence and take reputation risks. Sports commentators who had spent entire months carefully avoiding the subject, as if it were radioactive, suddenly found themselves under inescapable pressure to address the issue head-on. How do you continue ignoring something that Steph Curry considers not just worthy of comment, but worthy of passionate public defense? The WNBA itself, which had remained pathologically silent for weeks in the face of growing public pressure, found itself under inescapable global scrutiny to take concrete positions and implement real changes. Officials who had hidden behind empty corporate statements and diplomatically crafted declarations discovered that the entire world was watching and waiting for substantive action. But perhaps the deepest and most transformational impact was on Caitlin Clark herself as a human being. In subsequent interviews conducted weeks later, she expressed gratitude that transcended simple words and entered the realm of the spiritual. It wasn't just about having public support. It was about having supreme validation from someone whose opinion carried historic weight in the sport. When Steph Curry says you have the complete package, she said with visible tears in her eyes and voice choked with emotion. It changes something deep inside you forever. It changes how you see yourself. It changes how you believe in your own potential. And it really changed in observable ways. You could clearly see in her performances in the weeks following the statements. There was an even more unshakable confidence in pressure moments, an even fiercer determination in the face of adversity, an even more magnetic presence that commanded total attention. As if Curry's words had unlocked a level of psychological potential that not even she knew existed within her. What's most impressive is how this historic moment exposed the fundamental difference between superficial influence and real transformational impact. Millions of people around the world have some level of influence on social media. But how many have the moral power to draw ethical lines that millions voluntarily follow? Steph Curry definitively proved that when you combine supreme technical credibility with unshakable moral courage, you don't just influence temporary opinions, you shape entire historic eras. Have you ever wondered how many times in life we witness the birth of a new cultural paradigm in real time? Because that's exactly what happened before our eyes. Curry's words didn't just defend Caitlin Clark in a specific situation. They established a new permanent standard for how emerging greatness should be treated in professional sports and society in general. Young athletes around the world suddenly had a concrete template of how established legends should support rising talents. Fans had a clear example of how to express support in a constructive and effective way. Media had a model of how to cover emerging phenomena with responsibility and integrity. Sports organizations had a standard of how to protect their stars. It was impossible not to notice that something fundamental had changed irreversibly in American and global sports culture. The era of complicit silence in the face of obvious injustices had ended permanently. The era of active defense of greatness, regardless of personal consequences, had officially begun. Months later, when academic analysts and media specialists tried to scientifically quantify the total impact of Curry's statements, the numbers were literally surreal. Billions of impressions on social media in dozens of languages. Hundreds of millions of dollars in additional audience for the WNBA. Thousands of articles written in publications around the world. Documentaries being planned. Books being written. But numbers never tell the complete human story. The real, lasting story was in the individual lives touched, the permanently changed minds, the newly discovered and inspired courages. The real story was in the 12-year-old girl in Ohio who decided that if Steph Curry could publicly defend what was right, she could also find courage to defend classmates being bullied at school. The real story was in the Texas coach who taught his players that true champions elevate other champions, creating a generation of athletes with moral conscience. The real story was in the Nevada grandmother who discovered a new passion at 75 years of age because someone she respected had shown that it's never too late to care about justice. The real story was in the university professor whose students began passionately debating social responsibility and ethical use of influence. Naturally, this leads us to a deep understanding of the true permanent legacy of this moment that transcended sports. Steph Curry didn't just change the specific narrative about Caitlin Clark. He fundamentally redefined what moral leadership means in professional sports and modern society. Years later, when cultural historians write about this era of basketball and American culture, one specific moment will be remembered as the definitive and irreversible turning point. It wasn't a historic game. It wasn't an exciting championship. It was the precise moment when the greatest three-point shot revolutionary looked at a young revolutionary being systematically persecuted and said with all his moral authority, enough. And when Steph Curry says enough, with all his credibility, the entire world stops, listens with total attention, and changes forever. The deafening silence that had dominated for weeks was replaced by something much more powerful and lasting. The harmonious symphony of millions of voices voluntarily uniting in defense of true greatness. The words that left critics literally without arguments. The statements that moved millions of hearts around the world. The moment that changed everything forever. It's impossible not to feel that we witnessed history being written before our eyes. And the most beautiful and hopeful part? This history is just beginning to unfold. Because when established legends defend future legends, when greatness recognizes greatness without fear, when moral courage inspires even more courage, there's no conceivable limit to what becomes possible in the human experience. Steph Curry exploded, defending Caitlin Clark with a force that will echo for generations. And in the process, he did much more than defend a talented player in a difficult situation. He defended the very sacred idea that the future deserves active protection, that emerging greatness deserves courageous recognition, that complicit silence would never again be an acceptable option when injustice is happening right before our eyes. And millions of people around the world heard this transformational message and were never the same again.